Hey everyone, welcome back to Matt's Digital Odyssey. I'm your host, Matt Marlatt, and I'm here to guide you through the fascinating world of gaming and tech. Today we're diving into one of the most legendary rivalries in gaming history, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, versus the Sega Genesis. This wasn't just a battle of consoles, though. It was a battle of identities, of speed versus strategy, of grit versus polish. Now, full disclosure, I was a Sega kid. I grew up on the Genesis and its gritty, fast-paced games. I didn't get into the SNES titles till much later. Ironically, when I ran an SNES emulator on my Dreamcast. Think about it, Nintendo games running on a Sega console. It doesn't get more ironic than that. But personal bias aside, today we're breaking this rivalry down. From the hardware that powered these machines to the unforgettable games that defined a generation. All the playground debates that turned friends into rivals. This episode covers it all. Well, mostly. So grab your controller of choice and let's dive in. To set the stage, let's go back to the late 80s, early 90s. A transformative time for gaming for sure. Nintendo was riding high on the success of the NES, which had essentially saved the gaming industry from the crash of 1983. Nintendo was the undisputed king. Enter Sega. Sega was a powerhouse in the arcade space, known for fast-paced games and cutting-edge hardware. They wanted to replicate that success in the home console market, and in 1988, they launched the Mega Drive in Japan. A year later, it came to North America as the Sega Genesis. Genesis's marketing was bold, brash, and directly aimed at Nintendo. The tagline, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't," wasn't just clever, it was a shot across the bow. Sega was telling gamers, we're cooler, we're faster, we're for an older audience. Nintendo responded in 1991 with the SNES, and by then, Sega had already established a foothold. But Nintendo's strategy was different. While Sega leaned into speed and arcade thrills, Nintendo focused on creating immersive, polished experiences. They knew they had the legacy of the NES on their side, along with an unbeatable lineup of first-party developers. This wasn't just a business rivalry either, it became a cultural phenomenon. Were you a Sonic fan zipping through the levels with a burst of attitude, or were you Team Mario, exploring vibrant, meticulously designed worlds? The debates weren't just about the consoles either, they were about what kind of gamer you were. It was like being a Leafs fan or a Habs fan. Everyone had their side, and the rivalry was fierce. I still remember some of the playground arguments I had with people about the Genesis being better. Now let's dig into the hardware, because these consoles weren't just different, they were built to appeal to entirely different audiences. The Sega Genesis ran on a Motorola 68000 processor, clocked at 7.67 MHz, paired with the Zilog Z80 coprocessor. This setup made it fast, like really fast. The Genesis was designed to handle the kind of quick animations and smooth gameplay that you'd find in arcade games. This is why titles like Sonic the Hedgehog could deliver such a thrilling sense of speed. Sega leaned into this with their blast processing marketing campaign. Now, blast processing wasn't actually a real feature, but it sounded cool, and it cemented the Genesis's reputation for being a performance powerhouse. The SNES, on the other hand, it was all about flexibility and innovation. Its Ricoh 5A22 processor ran at a slower 3.58 MHz, but the Nintendo offset this with custom coprocessors that developers could include in game cartridges. The most famous of these was the Super FX chip, used in games like Star Fox. This chip enabled the SNES to render 3D polygons, a feat that the Genesis couldn't natively achieve. Graphically, the Genesis could display 512 colors with 61 on-screen at once. Its aesthetic was darker and more arcade-like, which worked really well for games like Shinobi and Streets of Rage, but the NES absolutely blew this out of the water with a palette of 32,768 colors and up to 256 on screen at any given time. This is why games like Super Mario World and Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past look so much more rich and vibrant. Then there's the Mode 7, a feature unique to the SNES. Mode 7 allowed for background scaling and rotation, creating pseudo 3D effects. Think of the twisting tracks in F-Zero or the cinematic map transitions of Super Mario Kart. These features gave the SNES an edge in creating immersive, dynamic visuals. Now we can finally move on to sound, probably my favorite part of this whole debate. The Genesis used a Yamaha YM2612 FM synthesizer, perfect for creating electronic, punchy soundtracks. That's why the Sonic the Hedgehog series soundtracks are still classics today. But the SNES, it had the Sony SPC700 chip, which allowed for sampled audio. This meant that the SNES games could deliver music that felt rich and dynamic. Just listening to the haunting themes of Chrono Trigger or the layered beats of Donkey Kong Country, even by today's standards, those tracks really hold up. All right, it's about time. Let's talk about the games, because no matter how powerful the hardware is, it's the games that defined a console. The Genesis made its mark with fast-paced arcade-style titles. Early hits like Altered Beast and Golden Axe showcased Sega's ability to bring the arcade experience home. Then came Sonic the Hedgehog. It wasn't just a game, it was a phenomenon, a console seller. They had their own Macy's Day balloon at one point. With his speed and attitude and vibrant worlds, Sonic became the face of the Genesis and a direct rival to Mario. Sega also excelled at sports games, with Joe Montana Football or NHL 94 becoming must-haves for fans of the genre. Let's not forget the Streets of Rage games, which brought a beat-em-up action to the forefront, and Gunstar Heroes, a personal favorite of mine and a standout in the run-and-gun genre. Sega also experimented with hardware expansions, like the Sega CD and 32X. The Sega CD added a layer of multimedia appeal with titles like Night Trap and Sonic CD, the latter introducing an unforgettable soundtrack. The 32X tried to bring 32-bit gaming to the Genesis with mixed success, but it did offer gems like Knuckles Chaotic and a couple of my personal favorites like Star Wars Arcade and a near arcade-perfect port of Virtua Fighter. These add-ons showed Sega's ambition, even if it didn't always hit the mark. The SNES, meanwhile, focused on depth and variety. Launch titles like Super Mario World set the tone, offering expansive worlds and impeccable gameplay. Then there were the RPGs, Final Fantasy VI, Earthbound, Secret of Mana, games that weren't just fun but emotionally impactful. The SNES also delivered unforgettable action adventures like The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which is kind of an RPG, but we'll let that slide, and platforming perfection in Donkey Kong Country. It became the go-to console for gamers who wanted story-driven experiences and a cinematic presentation. Cross-platform games also highlighted the differences between the two. Mortal Kombat is one of the best examples. The Genesis version had all the blood and gore intact, albeit locked behind a code, while the SNES versions were heavily censored, replacing blood with sweat. However, the SNES version looked and sounded better, creating a split among fans, myself included. It was a trade-off between edge and refinement, and a lot of the time it came down to personal preferences. Like some of the games that I enjoyed way more on Genesis were Earthworm Jim, Aladdin, and Jurassic Park. That counts, right? Nintendo also had plans to venture into the CD realm with the SNES CD, which eventually fell through, giving rise to one of their biggest competitors, the Sony PlayStation. While it never materialized, the idea hinted that the shift toward multimedia gaming, and it was going to be big. At the end of the day, the Genesis thrived on adrenaline, while the SNES excelled at in-depth and polished games. The choice honestly came down to what kind of gamer you were. So who ultimately won the console war? If we're talking sales, the SNES edged out the Genesis, selling 49 million units to Sega's 30 million. But this rivalry wasn't just about the numbers, it was about influence. The Genesis proved that Sega could compete with Nintendo, laying the groundwork for later innovations like the Sega Dreamcast and even the Sega Saturn in some ways. Meanwhile, the SNES cemented Nintendo's legacy as a company that prioritizes quality and creativity. This was also shown when they launched the N64. Most importantly, this rivalry forced the gaming industry to evolve. Sega and Nintendo pushed each other to innovate, and the results were better games, smarter hardware, and a more dynamic industry. Whether you were collecting rings in Green Hill Zone or exploring Hyrule, this was the golden age of gaming. And that's it for today's episode. The SNES versus the Genesis. It wasn't just a rivalry, it was a defining moment in gaming history. Were you Team Genesis or Team SNES? What was your favorite games on either platform? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So hit me up on social media at Marlat Media. Next time, we'll dive into the Sega Dreamcast, a console that was absolutely ahead of its time and remains a personal favorite of mine. From its groundbreaking features to its ultimate downfall, it's a story you won't want to miss. That wraps up for today's exploration. Keep playing, keep dreaming, and I'll see you on the next Odyssey.